serving Christian County, Missouri. Also with us today, we have Sarah Lawson, our project coordinator, and David Mitchell will be our featured guest expert panelist today on the economic outlook. And we're really excited about the information. With data, it's one of those things. It's not necessarily a lot of fun to dig into, but if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's definitely something that I've been clinging to through COVID-19. So I would like to give you a little bit more information about David. He is a Christian County resident, and David Mitchell received his PhD in 2001 from Oklahoma State University and is currently a full professor of economics and the director of the Bureau of Economic Research and the Center for Economic Education, both of which are at Missouri State University. He is also the president of CCM Economics LLC. He has published research in peer-reviewed journals on a variety of topics, including water quality, light pollution, housing values, low-income housing, the pedagogy of economic instruction, the economics of music, how economic conditions impact election outcomes, and several cost-benefit analysis studies. Furthermore, he has provided consulting work, economic studies, or economic forecast to the Missouri Housing Development Commission, the Missouri Department of Transportation, the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and the National Park Service, the Census Bureau, and many other state-level public agencies and private clients. He has been married for 25 years this August and has 3 kids, ages 22, 18, and 15. And in his spare time, when we're not in the midst of COVID, he really enjoys swimming and golf. So just like the rest of us here in Christian County, enjoys all of the amenities that this area has to offer. So David, welcome and good morning. Oh, I think, there you go.
Let's see, press, okay. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're, I know this started about an hour early, I think, than Andrea said you guys normally do, but I've got a student who's got to have class at 10 o'clock, and I wanted to make sure that there was enough bandwidth for her and for us. So.
Yeah, same. I'm a kindergarten teacher, so I've got my kiddo over here, and we're all just kind of doing life and hanging on to this new rhythm.
Yeah, it's actually quite annoying. So it's I haven't been out of the house in several days. I don't like it, but it is what it is.
Well, it's good to see you. And as we get started, I always like to remind our attendees, if you have questions, please submit those through the chat window, because that's why we have our experts in. You can submit those most efficiently directly through the chat to Sarah Lawson, and she will be monitoring those. As a reminder, we are recording this for the reference on our website, but we are not streaming this live onto Facebook. This resource live is specifically open to Show Me Christian County investors and stakeholders throughout our region. And we also extended this through our great network of chambers of commerce and betterment organizations. So David, that's kind of, all the nuts and bolts on my end. If you want to, we can really dig into the information.
Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. And thank you very much. So, economists like to name things. People like names. They like having things like names like the Great Depression or the Great Recession. I'm calling this the stay session of 2020. So if you hear that term, then you heard it here first. I don't know what other people are actually going to come up with. They might come up with other things, but it seems fitting. I thought basically I just kind of give an overview of how the economy was operating before. And it was literally like less than 2 months ago. Actually, literally 2 months ago today that I gave a forecast, and everything was hunky-dory on the assumption that the COVID didn't become a problem. All right, and so that's how fast this changed, and this is why I think it's really important that we have an understanding of the overview of the economy before this, before we move on. Now, Andrea was telling me that, this is about 20 minutes, so I tried to limit how much I'm talking about things going before that, so that we can kind of get to some of the things that are happening now and going forward. But I think that's important. The other one is, how's the economy performing? What kind of changes are already obvious? And the interesting thing is that the data hasn't even actually come out yet. So in May, we'll get the data. Let's see, you'll get preliminary data at the county level for how things were in March. Right? It'll be June before we have full estimates of what things are doing in March, and it will be August before we actually know for certain what actually happened in particular counties within March. And that kind of gives you a sense of, so some of the estimates that I have here, and you'll see that when we're talking about like the unemployment rate that I've already estimated. You know, keep that in mind that that's an estimate based upon models. So it's an estimate of an estimate of an estimate. And then basically I kind of have some steps forward here. So some things that maybe at the county level people can start kind of thinking about, because this is an opportunity also to kind of reset some parts of your economy if you so choose. So next slide, please. So here is what we have seen in terms of real GDP. This is in billions of 2012 dollars. And when we say SAAR, that's seasonally adjusted annual rate. And so that is that on these quarterly bases, if the economy was operating within that quarter during the entire year, what would it have been? And you can kind of see that you have these time periods where, and I don't have a pointer on here. Normally I have a little pointer when I'm doing these presentations in person, or I can walk up to the screen and go. But you can see here basically that when the one we had here in the Great Recession, you have the economy kind of coming up and then kind of coming down and then going like this, right? And then before that, the ones here in gray are these recessions. Then you had another one here basically in 2001, kind of almost looks kind of a bit of like a U-shaped recovery. And then you have one down in about the larger one here in 1982, 83. That's kind of almost more of a V-shaped recovery. The reason that I think that's important is because when we have these V-shaped or these U-shaped recoveries, we have a tendency to kind of get back to where we were fairly quickly. And if you look at this and you just kind of step aside and you just kind of, even if you just kind of cross your eyes a bit so that it just kind of becomes a little bit of a blur, you can see that from basically the one that you had here at the end of 1975 up until about 2000, that line is fairly constant, right, in terms of its slope. And the one that we had here for the Great Recession, basically in 2007, 2009, you can see that we did return to growth. We got to a point where we were before, but we never really kind of got back up to that previous growth line. So next slide, please. And so what you can see is this kind of shows you how bad the Great Recession actually was, right? So for example, this red line here is what real GDP could have been. This is what would have happened had you not had a recession. We had continued on with growth during this time period. And this is what we would call an L-shaped recovery. So this L-shaped recovery is not that we don't ever get back to where we were. We obviously did, right? The blue line here in 2020 is obviously higher than the red line in 2007. The point is that you never got back to the original growth rate. And over time, those really, really start to add up. So for example, I don't know if people can see this mouse moving. I doubt you can because you're viewing Sarah's screen, not mine. So you can see here you've got about a $2.2 trillion difference within the economy. Now this comes out to about $7,000 per person. So this is why it's really, really important to know, because if this is going to be a V-shaped recovery that we have with the stay session or a U-shaped recovery, then in the long term we're actually going to be okay. We'll have this really short time frame where we're seeing economic growth go down significantly, but if we kind of bounce back really, really quickly, in the long term, that's okay. Obviously, it's not good in the short term, but it's the long term that we're looking at. And this is why this is why I typically like to show this with this L-shaped recovery. We want to make sure that we avoid an L-shaped recovery at all costs. Next slide, please. So here we have our year-over-year percent growth in U.S. employment. And if you kind of see on this, on the ones after 2010, the last decade that we've had here, you can kind of get a sense of how severe the decline in employment was, right? So we saw that we got down to around a year-over-year percentage change growth of around maybe 4%. decline in employment. And we kind of bounced back. I wasn't quite as good as what you had in, say, in the 90s or in the 80s. So you still had some positive employment growth around 2%-ish on average, maybe a little bit less than that. But like I said, this kind of gives you a sense of how severe in terms of a year-over-year percent change in employment growth that we were looking at. And of course, with the stay session, this is going to be even worse. We're just hoping that it's going to be relatively a relatively short time frame. Next slide, please. Now, here is our Missouri quarterly GDP. Once again, this is seasonally adjusted annual rate in 2012 dollars. And once again, the gray part over here is the recession. That's the 07-09 recession, the Great Recession. And interestingly enough, when you kind of look at the data here, you can actually see that there was several time periods where, once again, a recession is technically defined as 2 consecutive quarters of declining economic growth. And if you look at these, so for example, in 2016, you can actually see that you've got declines where you have 3 consecutive quarters here where it's going down. You have the same thing happening here in 2012. So technically speaking, even though the U.S. economy was not in a recession, if you want to be technical about it, the Missouri economy actually was in a relatively brief, relatively mild recession here in 2016 and 2012. And this is something, of course, that a lot of people don't know. This is it can be hard for people to see this. So, but this kind of shows you that you know, Missouri as a whole, you know, after about 16, you saw relatively fast growth, where of course we're going to see a lot of that erase here for at least this quarter, possibly in the next quarter. And if we get done relatively quickly, I think we'll jump back up in the third quarter. But it kind of depends upon how long this continues to go on. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at major interest rates. We have the rate on, say, the 30-year mortgage and the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond. And we can see, of course, that these guys have fallen significantly. And if you switch to the next slide, we can kind of get a sense of an interest rates, I think, that are really, really important to people, and that's going to be the real mortgage rate. So here you're looking at, this is once we're taking away from inflation, you're looking at a real rate for your mortgage of about 1.9%. So that's really, really good, right? Over a 30-year time frame. I mean, your house, as long as it's appreciating faster than 1.9% per year, even if you're borrowing the money, you're better off. Unfortunately, of course, nobody can go buy a house right now. And if the recession gets really, really severe and it takes a long time frame, then it doesn't do you any good that the rate's 1.9%. But what I'm trying to illustrate from this is that the fundamentals of the economy are actually still fairly strong. This is what we're trying to illustrate. There hasn't been anything that's happened where, you know, capital has been destroyed or people have suddenly become less educated or anything else like that. The basic fundamentals of the U.S. economy are still relatively strong. The problem is you just can't go out and shop, all right? Next slide, please. Here, once again, the same thing for Missouri. You can see that ever since about, I think we started in 2011, if I remember correctly, is when we started seeing employment growth within the state. And you can kind of see we have this relatively, you know, good old-fashioned upward trend. You know, I've got a little bit of a bump there at the end where it's declining. You can ignore that. That's very normal in the data. That data is subject to a high amount of revision from month to month to month. It's only after about 3 to 4 months after the data comes out that it actually becomes reliable. So when you see things like that, you can kind of basically ignore that. That's not a reflection of the decline in employment that has already started to occur. Once again, like I said, that data isn't even out yet. We're still on February data at the county level for employment. So, you know, you can ignore that. That's not what that is. So once again, same thing, right? You're seeing relatively strong growth. The fundamentals of the Missouri economy still basically strong. Remember, we looked at that when we were looking at the GDP numbers. They were all going up. Everything was looking fairly good. Next slide, please. So here is our 2-year change in employment in terms of percentages. And you can kind of see on this map, it's a really good thing we don't live in the northern part of the state. Over there, you're looking at large changes in employment, except they're going in the wrong direction. They're negative. So the reds and the oranges and the kind of light oranges are all negative employment. You have actually fewer people employed today than you had 2 years ago. And remember, this is during a really, really good economy. The northern part of the state is just simply depopulating. It's just they're leaving it. I mean, the data going back for years and years and years is just obvious. And you can kind of see the southwest portion of the state here in Christian and Greene County, our metro area, with the exception of one county, we're all doing well. We're seeing employment growth well over 2% within the last 2 years. Next slide, please. So here's one of the things that I think is really, really interesting. This is the employment changes in Missouri from year to year. Like I said, we could have introduced the January and the February data, but it's not significantly different. So let's just go ahead and just keep it on a year-to-year basis. And you can see here from December 2018 to December 2019, where we have seen, and so we saw declines in wholesale, information, utilities and transport, PBS, that's professional business services, manufacturing, mining and logging. Of course, mining and logging is not a big portion of employment within the state of Missouri. And then you can see where we've seen growth, right? Government, retail, leisure and hospitality, other services. And then what's interesting here, fire, that's financial services, real estate, insurance, construction, and education and health, right? So 2/3 of all the new jobs in Missouri last year were in basically fire, construction, and ed health. And once again, fires, finance, insurance, and real estate. And interestingly enough, 36%, 1/3 of all of the new jobs were in education and health. Now, I've got another slide that I typically show people, and it's not education. Education and health are together, but it's not education that's going up. It's all health. So basically 1/3 of all the new jobs that came in Missouri last year were basically within health. Next slide, please. And here we can see essentially the exact same thing over now. We're looking over a 10-year time frame, right? Because we know that we can have lots of changes in particular industries from year to year. But if we look at this over a long period time frame, is when we get a chance to kind of average it out, right? So over the last 10 years, what have we seen? We've seen government employment shrink significantly. We've seen information shrink significantly. That's nothing new. That's been happening throughout the whole U.S. Construction has actually declined. Other service, wholesale, mining and logging declined. And you'll see that manufacturing's had a slight uptick, not that much. Retail, a slight uptick. Utilities and transportation, a slight uptick. Once again, fire, finance, insurance, and real estate, a slight uptick. But the big things, 87%, basically almost 9 out of every 10 jobs in the U.S. economy in the past decade have been basically in 3 different sectors: leisure and hospitality, PBS, professional business services, and education and health. And then once again, I wanted to stress that 40% of all of those new jobs have come basically just in education and health. And then once again, I mean, people say to themselves, oh, how much is education, how much is health? Almost none of it's education. Education is actually declining. Health is the one that's increasing. And that shows you how large the actual increases in health is, because remember, you're seeing these declines basically in education employment. And if 40% of all of the new jobs have been in the fields of education and health, with education declining, that shows you that health is just going gangbusters, right? So these are the types of things that people, when we're thinking long term, that we want to be thinking of, right? Because I think that a lot of especially at the local level, people think, oh, we need to make sure that we're bringing back our manufacturing. We need to make sure that we're bringing back thus and so. And manufacturing is good. I'm not saying that it's not good, but it's not going to be the growth for the future. The growth for the future is going to be health, and the demographics are going to show that out. Next slide, please. So here we can see what the 30-year % change in Missouri population has been. Now, way over here on the far left side, you see all ages. And so we have seen over the last 30 years a roughly, I think it's about 18 or 19% increase in population within the state. And you can see age 0 to 4 is essentially 0, 5 to 9 barely shows up, 10 to 14 is, I don't know, 10, let's call it 8%. Same thing for 15 to 19. And you can see it going all the way from basically 0 to 40 to 44, right? The percentage change in the population that's age 40 to 44 in the last 30 years is 0. There's been no growth in that. And you see other ones for other ages, for example, 30 to 34, it's actually shrunk. We actually have fewer people age 30 to 34 today than we had 30 years ago. But when we look at the other end of the scale, 45 to 49, 50 to 54, et cetera, you see large increases, right? And this is not just endemic to Missouri, this is endemic almost everywhere. You're seeing this huge, it's just demographics. There just simply aren't enough people, having babies basically to replace all the people that are getting older. The baby boomers are getting older, and there's not enough people behind them from Gen X and the millennials to actually replace all of this. And so you're seeing these huge shifts in the age structure going to these much higher ages.
Yeah, David, that's a really interesting point, because here in Christian County, our growth has been largely in those younger families. And so, it's really interesting to see how we've seen the attraction of the younger folks that are here, and really what leads to that when it comes to the amenities and the proximity to the regional attractions that we have. We've talked about that a lot, and how we are really fortunate to see that growth in this area as compared to the entire state as a whole, because you're right, birth rates are not what they used to be, and that impacts what we'll see in the future and how we bounce back from a workforce perspective.
Exactly. And this is the problem. We don't want to become Northern Missouri. When you're looking at and you can see it, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at population, you're looking at employment, you're looking at labor force participation rate. If you kind of go back to that map, if you can, if you want to, if you don't, that's great. But you've got this whole basically northern third of Missouri it is literally depopulating. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at a 5-year change in employment, a 10-year change in employment, 1-year change in population. You can look at basically any metric that you want to. You're going to see a whole lot of red up in the northern third, and that is what we want to avoid. When you look at these long-term time frames, you see St. Louis kind of basically not doing much. It's not that it's not declining, but it's not really growing. Over the past, I've been in Missouri, I guess 15 years now. Kansas City has kind of started to come back a little bit. It used to kind of not do much of anything. And then Southwest Missouri was basically the growth driver for a lot of the state. Now that's kind of started to shift to a little bit to Kansas City, but it's not because Southwest Missouri is not growing. It's just that Kansas City has kind of basically caught back up. So when you're looking at this when you're comparing these two regions, Kansas City is starting to grow a little bit more than it was in the past.
Yeah, and
the growth is not happening in St. Louis.
Yeah,
it's happening in Southwest Missouri, and it's happening in Kansas City.
And and that's one of the things that we study. And when we look at this and how COVID is impacting, there are already, I think, projections that we've seen and resources that I've been plugged into through the International Economic Development Council that are projecting almost an equalization of how you talked about, depopulating areas in those rural and suburban areas. People are wanting and are going to want more space to themselves after this. And so, that really leads us to think, if we were growing before, we will see tremendous growth after this potentially, as people are looking to those suburban and rural areas. And, what do we need to do as leaders in this region to really stay on the front edge of that? Placemaking didn't go away just because we had a pandemic. We just had to shift our thinking a little bit. So I didn't want to derail you, but just really interesting points.
No, but you're exactly right, because look at New York, right? New York is where you have all of these people very, very tightly compacted in. It's very, very easy, for things like viruses to spread. It just is. it's going to be easier there than it will be in, say, Christian County, simply because people are more concentrated. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, you're looking at around 74,000 people per square mile in Manhattan.
Wow.
So, I mean, it's just the numbers are just huge. I mean, it's, if you've ever been to New York, I mean, it's neat. I mean, I like walking around New York, but it is incredibly compact.
Yeah.
And you know, and that's an amenity that some people want, and there's other amenities that people that don't want. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about on the last couple of slides. I think kind of some ways forward where this is actually an opportunity, I think, for counties to kind of reset. So.
Yeah. And Sarah, we can go back to the original slide. Thanks so much for doing that.
Yeah. So, like I said, I mean, once again, just kind of stressing, you know, you can't overcome demographics. Basically, I mean, when opportunities for healthcare come in, you want to grab those. And you know, some counties have limited. I mean, obviously, all counties have limited resources, right? So sometimes maybe if it is a choice between the manufacturing facility or the hospital, you might want to choose the hospital. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we're looking at Missouri new weekly unemployment claims. And you can kind of see that this is from 12/21/2019. So you see it at the weekly level at the state. At the county level, it's only going to be at the monthly level. And you can kind of see, I mean, basically kind of bumping along there all the way from 12/21 to 2019. So this isn't the unemployment rate. It's not the number of unemployed people. It's just the number of new claims that are coming in. So people are obviously coming in, and obviously people are going out during this entire time frame. And you can see all the way up there till 3/14/2020, you had basically 4,000 new unemployment claims within the entire state of Missouri. And that does not mean that the increase in unemployment was only 4,000. Some people might have become unemployed and not filed their claim. Some people might not have been eligible. Some people had filed in, say, maybe March of 7 or April or February 29, et cetera. But it's just kind of gives you a sense of the new claims that are coming in. Now, in 2 weeks later, March 28th, we were up to 104,230 new unemployment claims. My oldest son, who's a senior in college, works at the Alamo, which is in Springfield. It's the movie theater, and he got laid off. They've closed. He's filed for unemployment. And to give you a sense of how bad it is, he filed 5 weeks ago, and he has yet to receive any unemployment compensation. He hasn't received anything. He's still filling out the paperwork. So I don't even know if he's even counted in this 104,230. I mean, he's literally been going back for 5 weeks, going to go back and revise claims and things like that. That's how far back they are. So these numbers are obviously could be quite large, right? So you're looking at basically a 26-fold increase within roughly 2 weeks, a huge increase. Next slide, please. So once again, remember I said at the state level, we've got March data. At the county level, you're still on February data. You won't get March preliminary estimates until May. You'll get March estimates in June. You'll get the revisions in July, and you'll get the second set of revision that they're a whole lot more confident in, and actually in August at the county level. So this is the state level, right? So here you're looking at our most recent data that we have is actually in March. The most recent data for the U.S., of course, or strike that. I forgive me. This is the state of this is the U.S. is what I meant to say. So we have our March data will come out in May. That's for the state. The county level will be February. In May, right? So the states are a month behind the country. The counties are a month behind the states, basically. So once you start getting it, like I said, this is why it's really, really difficult to get data at the county level. It's just still too new yet. So here for the whole US as a whole, we had 152, these are all in thousands, so you had 152 million in employment. In March, it fell to 151. Right now, this is the establishment survey data. This happens on the pay week that ends in the 12th. And you'll remember on the previous slide when we were looking at the unemployment claims, the 14th, right, is when we were at 3976. So basically, the establishment survey data is collecting their data. They're saying, okay, how many people are employed basically on the 12th? And here, in essence, is what we had, right? So mining and logging's got this small decline, but basically you can ignore that. That guy bumps up and down, up and down, up and down like that all the time. He stays fairly consistent. On this left-hand side, we have those that are declining. So this is construction, durable manufacturing, non-durable manufacturing. So these are things like food products, retail trade, transportation and warehouse, financial services, PBS, education and health, leisure and hospitality, and then other services. And one of the things that I think is really, really interesting, you'll notice that all of these guys are declining. We don't want them to decline, obviously, but they're still fairly small, except for leisure and hospitality. It's already basically at a 3% decline in March. And once again, we're not even all the way through the month of March yet. You haven't even hit the midpoint of March, and you're already looking at a 3% decline in leisure and hospitality. On the right-hand side, we saw the ones that basically didn't change or we had slight growth in: wholesale trade, utilities, information, and government. All right. So this kind of gives you a sense of, I mean, it should be obvious to basically everybody where you're going to see a lot of these large declines in employment initially. Leisure and hospitality and retail trade are going to be the next to get hit. Durable manufacturing is going to get hit really hard. Non-durable, you should see some declines, but not nearly as much as you see with durable. The longer this goes on, the more that guy is going to spread as more and more people start becoming unemployed. I always say anybody can do anything for a couple of weeks. As it gets longer and longer and longer, it gets harder and harder and harder to actually come back from that. Next slide, please. So to kind of give you a sense of how things have changed, I've got a couple of slides here on some relatively important metrics that economists look at. One of this is the price of oil. And we can see, obviously, we've seen these huge declines in the price of oil. People were talking about how the price of oil was negative yesterday. That's not that the oil itself was negative, it was the futures contract. And the futures contract is expiring, and now you actually have to take possession of the oil, but nobody wants to buy it, and now you have to find a place to store it. That's why it's in essence becoming negative. The negative portion is accounting for basically the storage cost, and there are barriers that there's no place to store it. That's the problem, and that's why it's negative. But when you're looking here at the price of these other ones, like say Brent, you're down to around $20. Next one here is for gold. We can see these relatively large increases here. Once again, in March is when we started to see this. We started to see gold running up. Next slide, please. Copper is one of the interesting ones here. And the interesting thing about copper is that copper is a really great predictor of recessions, because it's used in construction and it's used in, it's basically got a lot of industrial uses and it has a lot of commercial uses, right? So it's in your phones, and it just has so many uses. So if all economic activity is starting to decline, you're going to see people's demand for copper decline. You're going to see price declines. That's not necessarily what the price is doing. It's the change in price that's important. And so you can see how large of a decline here you've seen in the price of copper. But interestingly enough, and this is where, like I said, I have some hope, you can see that it dropped down here to about $2.10, and then it's actually kind of bumped back up a bit, right? So it's not like, oh my gosh, the whole world is coming to an end. We're not even in a 5th-story building, so if we jump, it's not going to do us any good. There is, basically some hope. Next slide, please. And once again, this is kind of why I like using copper. You can see it's these relative declines relative to what you had before. It's not necessarily the price per se. Obviously, the reason that you saw these changes after 2005 is the explosion in computers. that you've really seen over the past, say, 15 years. And you can see, like I said, these relatively large increases here, or increases and decreases. So next slide, please. So we have what's called our copper gold ratio. This is kind of a growth to fear proxy. So basically, when there's an increase in fear, you see kind of this flight to gold. And over this copper gold price ratio, if the price of gold is going up, obviously that ratio is going to fall. The exact opposite occurs if there's growth, right? So the price of gold comes down and the price of copper goes up, and that ratio will actually increase. And once again, it's not necessarily the numbers, it's the change. It's how is this guy changing? And so you can see here in 2020, relatively large decline, right? You're seeing people move. The proxy is to fear, not to growth, right? Next slide. So S&P 500, here's what we have seen over the past basically 2 years. Give you a sense of how large the decline has been. And then next slide, where we have essentially kind of input the 100-day average on that. And so, you can see here basically from about, looks like about October-ish, we actually started to exceed the 100-day average really well. And now we've come way down. But we have kind of bumped back up a bit since that. So, we had this huge sell-off. It's going to be like that for a while, but it is kind of coming back a little bit. Next slide, please. So here we see gasoline sales, and I don't know if you guys can see it. I've got people over here on my side, but this goes back all the way to 2010, and you can see, roughly speaking, you're looking at around 9,000 per week is what this is, and then we have this relatively large decline, obviously because people aren't driving. Next slide. Now here we've kind of got a bit of a shorter time frame where we have our weekly sales and whether we have our 4-week moving average. And we can once again see relatively large declines and declines of about, once again, I think I had how much the decline was there, but I've got people on my screen over here. I think it was like 43%, but I can't remember. Next slide. Trying to get a sense of the time too. So, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Charles Dickens, right? He always says it best. I've got the S&P 500 Retail Industry Index, and I've got the share price of Amazon. And I indexed them to what they were on January 2nd of this year, and set that index equal to 100. And you can see that the Amazon and this Retail Industry Index are moving together in sync all the way up until, January. And then these guys kind of actually start to diverge. And then you can see, of course, you're seeing the normal good old-fashioned retail is actually down about 28%, whereas Amazon's actually up 23% year to date from this time frame. So this huge divergence. And you can see, of course, in March of 16, 18, March 19, 20, this divergence really starts to grow. And so this is one of the things that I think is really interesting, because people are dumping basically your old retail stocks and they're all moving into Amazon. And I think that could be indicative of a couple of things. Next slide, please. So taxable sales, right? In Greene County, Springfield's 82% of all taxable sales for the entire county. You've got all of the other little bitty cities, and the rural part, 18%. Now for Christian County, it's a little bit more spread out. So you've got Nixa and Ozark, roughly equal, about 35 and 40%, respectively, and the other little bitty cities and rural parts of the county, basically at 25%, right? So at the county level, people need to be very conscious of what's going on in Ozark and Nixa. It's not that the other 25% aren't important. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that if you're going to see declines in Ozark and Nixa, those are going to have a much larger effect on you than the other parts. Same thing here for Greene County. If Springfield starts to decline, that's what's you're going to really start to feel that pain a whole lot more than you would in the rural parts of the county. Next slide, please. So here's what we're seeing in terms of unemployment claims in Christian and Greene County. And if I remember correctly, Greene is now at 13,000. These are estimates. And I think Christian was at, I think 5,000, 4,500, something of that nature in terms of these unemployment claims. Now, once again, these are estimates because you'll notice this is all monthly data. So you have to use the monthly unemployment claims for the state to estimate the monthly unemployment claims for the counties. But we don't have the full unemployment claims for the state yet, right? The month of March isn't done. The month of April is not done. So these are estimates. And these estimates are what we're going to be using to create the estimates for unemployment. But I think they're going to be fairly close to what it actually is. So once again, we can see these relatively large increases in unemployment claims in Christian and Greene County, and much more so in Greene County than in Christian. Next slide, please. And then here we get what I estimate the unemployment rate is right now within Christian and Greene County, based upon the unemployment claims that we've seen in Missouri, modeling that into the county level, modeling that into today. Remember, we're looking at employment in the county levels is still in February, right? So you're trying to project into today with you won't know today's data for the counties until June or July is when you'll actually start to actually know what the actual number is. And like I said, there's people covering this, and when I was estimating it this morning, so I think Christian County, or strike that, I think Greene County was in the 16% range, and I think Christian County is like 12.3%. Is my best guess estimate for basically right now. And of course, that's subject to change. That gives you a sense of how large this has become. And hopefully it comes down relatively quickly. Next slide, please. So kind of summing up, right? I mean, recognize that the change is constant, right? The economy is always changing. One of the things that I've been telling people, and these are more, the second one here is more of a long-term strategy. This is not the short-term strategy. What am I going to do for the next 6 months? This is a long-term strategy. You cannot fight demographics, right? If the population is starting to skew older, that means something. That means you need particular things. If the population skewing older and younger people are moving into your part of the country, that means something else. And so you basically need to try to leverage that as much as possible. New sources of revenue. Like I said, when you're looking at this relatively large increase in Amazon and this relatively large decrease in what's happening within good old-fashioned normal retail, that tells you that, I mean, in my opinion, a sales tax on, you go to the mall and you buy a shirt, that as a source of revenue in the long term is just simply not going to work out. People are moving more and more to online shopping. You have to find a way to capture that as essentially as a revenue source. And I tried to find data on how many new Amazon Prime people have come in. They're not releasing that data, and even if they do, it's on a yearly basis, but it has to be large. I think Netflix saw an increase. I saw this in the Wall Street Journal a couple days ago. I think they have added 15 million new subscribers just in the past month, and they were already kind of starting to plateau in terms of the number of new subscribers, and it's increased significantly. I think Amazon's doing the exact same thing, and the more you get used to that, the longer this goes on, the harder it is to get back to the car, drive to the mall, and buy your shirt when you've been buying it on Amazon for the past 3 to 4 months. So this has kind of led me to one of the things that when people ask me, well, what does our region do? I always say you need specialization with generalization. And the reason that I tell people that is even when I'm not talking to people in Missouri, if I'm talking to people in San Francisco, I use the example of Branson. Branson has $1.1 billion in taxable sales that occurs within its city every single year. That's a huge number. I think Kansas City, if I remember correctly, was around 5 to 6 billion in terms of these taxable sales. And of course, Branson's really, really small. You've got a population there of about 10,000 compared to the population that you have in Kansas City. So if you have $1.1 billion in taxable sales, how hard is COVID going to hit Branson? People aren't shopping. They're not going out to the shows. Their amusement parks are going to be closed. I mean, if it's going to be bad here in Christian County, it's going to be really bad in Taney County, right? So you want to have specialization. It's okay to have specialization, but if you have all of your eggs in one basket, then you need to make sure that you have large amounts of what I would call rainy day funds. You need to be able to make sure that you can get through these things when your specialized industry is in decline. Disney is another great example. There's talk about Disney not opening up until June or July. And the thing that I read is that they're burning through $30 million in cash per day. So even a company as large as Disney cannot burn through $30 million in cash per day forever. It's just simply, it's unsustainable. They're not selling sports. There's no ESPN. Nobody's coming to the parks. Nobody's shopping in the stores. The only source of revenue that they have is streaming. And even then, that's the cost of acquiring all of the streaming isn't anywhere near enough to, it's larger than the revenues. They're still losing money on the streaming right now. They haven't actually had a chance to amortize all of those costs. So a company like Disney is, I mean, they are literally burning through cash. And so a city like Orlando that's completely dependent upon tourism is going to get hit really, really hard. So it's okay to specialize, but if you do, you need to make sure that you've got a backup plan. And that's why I say it's better to have specialization with some generalization. So I use the state of Wyoming here, which most of their sales, most of their revenue comes from oil, gas, and mining. The state of Wyoming has a 400-day rainy day fund. So the state of Wyoming could have no tax revenue coming in for 400 days, and they could still pay for all government services going forward for the next 400 days. They're specialized. They can't generalize. So they say, oh, okay, what happens if these revenues decline? We need to make sure that we've got ourselves covered. So either specialize with generalization, or if you're just going to specialize, you know, basically governments, cities, whatever, individuals need to make sure they have a large rainy day fund. Next slide, please. So you can see my contact information here. That says the number to my office, which obviously I'm not in. So I have my cell phone here, and obviously that's 417, not 471. If you have questions or you want to contact me, and of course the easiest way is through email. I, like most of you, get so many calls. You know, you get 20 calls a day from telemarketers, so my phone's on silent all the time. So really the best way to get a hold of me is through email.
Yeah, David, I appreciate it so much. And, you know, there were some really great takeaways there and things that I learned, you know, just from some basis and some foundation. You know, early on, you mentioned all in all that we have a strong foundation, which should lead us and lend to a strong recovery. If and when we're able to really start turning that around. And as we put in our newsletter on Monday, you know, the leaders in this area are hard at work on working hand in hand with our health department officials and kind of forming that strategy for what that will look like. And, you know, when you were talking about the jobs that were growing largely across the state, we see that here. We are a good reflection in that kind of fire category. You mentioned, you know, finance, insurance, real estate. That is Christian County. We have a lot of those professionals that are here and that are active in this region. And health jobs, you know, being here in Springfield, all in all, I know we're very fortunate. While the impacts to the non-essential services in healthcare are really hitting hard at the moment, we have that talent pipeline that's here for the healthcare jobs. And I think that really speaks to a good future. And one of the most interesting things that you mentioned in your slides, that was a great takeaway, is that copper equals hope. I've never heard that. I've never kind of seen that metric, and really appreciated you bringing that through. Can you speak to a little bit? I know you and I talked on the phone. and you reference in some of your slides the length of time and how that makes an impact, and how, yes, we might see some numbers drop down that were potentially lower than the Great Depression, but can you speak a little bit to the length of time that was, and just to kind of bring the hope through numbers that this is a short space that we're seeing and not necessarily a decade?
Exactly. One of the they're looking, like I said, on that seasonally adjusted annual rate. Do not be surprised if the second quarter it's in the negative 30 to 40% range. They could be really, 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 really large. I mean, people literally cannot function. The government is literally mandating that people basically sit at home. So you can't shop, you can't make cars, there's a whole litany of things that you cannot do. That number doesn't scare me so much as let's make sure that doesn't become a long-term thing. And in fact, James Bullard, he is the president of the St. Louis Federal Reserve. He has actually said we should not even literally technically call this a recession because the government is mandating that things shut down. He thinks that we should basically just write it all off. I mean, you just literally, in the history books, you just put a giant X there and you say none of this counts.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Oh, Sarah messaged, I know we've had several questions submitted. So are you open to kind of taking those questions now from our attendees?
Perfect. So we've had a couple of questions. We're going to try and get to them here. This was a question that was submitted before our webinar, and it says, of particular interest to Ozark, the only municipality in the Springfield area without a use tax, is how the pandemic and stay-at-home orders will permanently affect shopping habits. Can we expect online shopping to continue at high levels and therefore continue having a negative effect on Ozark sales tax revenues?
I think that you can. And like I said, I mean, before you had a general move towards more and more online shopping. And I think this just accelerates it. People are now more and more and more in the habit of doing online shopping. It's going to increase, right? They went out and they got faster internet. They already paid for the faster internet because now the kids are home and they've got to have, Zoom for all of their classes and stuff. And now they're on more and more and more. It's a habit, right? I mean, people used to be, when I was a kid, mom and dad would drop us off at the mall and we'd be mall rats and we'd walk around the mall and we'd spend money and we'd buy a t-shirt and a soda and a pretzel and, we're just kind of goofing off. When I go to the mall, I don't see teenagers doing that as much anymore. And as people are getting more and more out of the habit, the longer this goes on, I think the more people are going to get in, that's going to become ingrained. That's what I'm talking about, of finding new revenue sources. And one, of course, the thing that it's difficult is that you have to convince the taxpayer in Christian County that this is actually in their best interest. And in essence, what you're doing is you're not adding a new tax, you're replacing the tax that was already in place, because people simply aren't shopping in that particular way anymore. This is the tax that you need basically to fund the basic government services. And in order to continue to have growth, you do have to have basic fundamental government services being funded. I mean, that's just part of the way that it is. And so I feel for the people in Ozark who are trying to get that passed. I think Nixo passed theirs. I think Ozark is the only one that does not have that.
Right.
And I think it's on the ballot again. I think it failed before. But I would definitely, I mean, I hate to keep saying you got to keep bringing it back up, but you probably need to, because the sales tax revenues are going to continue to decline, especially with the pandemic. If this thing goes on and on for too long, you will start seeing restaurants close, and you will start seeing a lot of the small retailers close. Sure. And you have to find a way to capture those tax dollars.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you for that insight, David. Another question that we received goes back to the unemployment claims data that you presented, and this is asking about whether or not we can see that data on the city level and not just on the county level.
You can see unemployment on the city level but usually it is at the metro area level. So if you want to be able to know what's happening within, like I said, you've got the March data for the US, it's February data for Missouri, January data for the counties, and depending upon the city size, usually you have to go back to December-ish or sometimes even November. The data just falls, it just goes, it's just that slow. Usually the data that comes out at the city level tends to be actually annual or quarterly. The BLS just simply doesn't collect it at the city level. And it's really interesting how they do it. I mean, you would think it'd be really, really easy to count how many people are working and how many people are not working. But it's actually an incredibly difficult process to get accurate, and that's in essence why it takes so long. They want to make sure that they're completely accurate with the process. So we won't actually know unemployment levels and for the city of Ozark or the city of Nixa or Highlandville or whatever, it'll be months before we're actually able to determine what the unemployment rates are actually today. And that's why I said those ones that are out there today are basically estimates. It's an estimate of this, which is used to become an estimate of this, which is used to become an estimate of that. So there's actually a relatively high degree of, be tongue in cheek with those basically, use a large grain of salt. But I think that's it's a mid estimate, but I think the ranges are actually fairly high, if that makes sense. You've got large cones of uncertainty, if that makes sense.
Sure. One other question we received in the chat is, can you speak more about the economic impacts, positive and negative, as it relates to the university specifically?
So I think one of the things that is interesting with universities, they're really great for long-term growth, and they're really great for short-term growth. But it's the long-term growth is what you're really, really interested in. I always tell people, and I know that, if you're a county administrator and tax revenues are down and you have to fund basic services, I mean, you're scrambling for that particular quarter. But I'm more of a long-term. I have a much more long-term perspective on things because, like we said, with the mining and logging, right, it goes up and down and up and down and up and down, and there's a whole lot of that throughout all economic data. What I'm interested in more term is there a long-term growth trend up? One of the great things about universities, I think, is that they develop a lot of human capital, and it's human capital that's going to be the growth in the future, not the old ways of doing things. This is why I said things like healthcare, fire, education. These things are where you're seeing the growth, not necessarily in manufacturing. You're going to see more robots in manufacturing, not less. So education, the universities really helps, I think, in the long term to build an educated workforce where people want to come. You're seeing, and this is throughout the whole country, I mean, you're seeing more and more concentration. People are moving into San Francisco despite the fact that it costs so much to move there. There's something about San Francisco and Seattle and San Diego and Dallas and Kansas City and Chicago and New York. I mean, the metro areas are growing large. And part of that, I think, has to do a lot with this human capital. And the human capital works really, really well when people are together. It doesn't work very well if people are apart. So I think universities help contribute to that. Also for the short term, I mean, the short term is you've got a bunch of students here from Cape Girardeau that come in, and now they're spending dollars here. And when they're done with school, they might stay. And so now you've captured this short-term person, you've turned them into a long-term person. So not only do you get, in the long term, they're spending locally, they're buying a house, they're paying taxes, but they're also contributing and helping to contribute and raise basically the level of human capital within the county or within the city. So I'm a big believer in that, but of course I work in education, so I'm a little bit biased.
Well, all in all, it's been phenomenal insights today. And if there are additional questions, as a reminder, David's contact information is there on the screen. You can also submit those to info@showmeccmo.com. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this recording will be posted to our website shortly. And so in the next couple days, you'll be able to reference that. Sarah put the email address through the chat to everyone. So if you need that as a reference point. And David, thank you again. We've already had some things submitted to ask if we can do this on a regular basis. And so as we ourselves as an organization is working to adapt and bring that information to our stakeholders, we want to make sure that we're getting that information into their door. And thank you for, being a resident that's local and for being able to bring those insights to us. We've really enjoyed your time today, and we are right at 10. And I know you mentioned that your daughter has a class. So we want to be mindful of your bandwidth as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we really look forward to staying in touch. Stay safe and stay well.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.